A judge insulted and spat on the case file of a poor black woman, never realizing she was Jasmine Crockett, senior legal advisor to the White House. 72 hours later, he was suspended, 6 dismissed cases were reopened, and the entire justice system began to shake. For the first time, the man in power was forced to face real justice. But is this the end, or just the beginning of an even greater reckoning? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was just past 8 a.m. when Jasmine Crockett stepped off the train platform into Glen Ridge, an unassuming town with old brick buildings, a courthouse that hadn't seen renovation since the Cold War, and a justice system that was rotting beneath its marble facade. The president had sent her here quietly with one mission: to uncover whether the whispers about corruption, racial bias, and systemic injustice in the local court were more than just rumors. She wasn't here to give speeches or hold press conferences. No motorcade, no entourage. Instead, she wore faded jeans, a wrinkled white button-down, and sneakers that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back into a loose bun, face bare of makeup, and in her hands she clutched a thick stack of documents. Legal papers, yes, but not the kind people expected from a White House advisor. She looked like any other exhausted single mother desperate for a court date. Just another soul caught in the grinding teeth of the system, and that was the point. Jasmine knew that true power didn't walk through the front door wearing a badge. It slipped in through the side and listened. But just as Jasmine settled into her seat near the filing window, blending in like any other tired civilian seeking justice, a sudden ripple of movement caught her eye. A door creaked open at the far end of the marble hallway, and the sound of hard-soled shoes echoed with unnatural sharpness. Stepping into view was Judge Henry Kemp, towering, square-jawed, his black robe draped over a pristine white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow as if he were ready to roll up justice itself. He didn't walk. He loomed, shoulders stiff with the authority of a man who had ruled from the bench for over 3 decades and had never once been challenged in his own domain. His face, weathered and pale, bore that unmistakable brand of arrogance that grows from decades of unchecked power. And behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his pale blue eyes swept the room like searchlights looking for an enemy. When he spotted Jasmine sitting quietly, waiting with a folder clutched in her lap, his entire body halted mid-step, like he'd just seen someone crash the gates of his sanctuary. He stared, not a curious glance, not confusion. A cold, calculated glare, as if her very presence was an offense. And then, without warning, he turned his head toward the nearest security officer and raised his voice for the whole room to hear. "Has anyone run a background check on this woman?" he barked, his finger now pointing toward her like a loaded gun. "She doesn't look like she belongs here." The words exploded into the air like a gunshot in a chapel. Instantly, the already quiet room went dead silent. Papers stopped rustling. Keyboards stopped clicking. Even the overhead lights seemed to hum a little louder. Every single head turned toward Jasmine, not slowly, not subtly, but all at once, like a scene choreographed in a bad play. Her skin burned beneath their stares. Some were confused, others were amused, a few were outright disgusted. She saw it all in flashes: the wrinkled forehead of a court stenographer, the side-eye from a woman in a sharp skirt suit, the way a man in an old veteran's cap leaned to whisper something to his friend. The whisper was short. The laugh that followed it was not. Across the room, a young mother clutched her toddler tighter on her lap. 2 clerks exchanged glances over the copy machine. A bailiff shifted his weight, resting one hand on the baton at his hip, as if Jasmine had suddenly transformed into a threat. And Jasmine, she sat frozen, not out of fear, but in quiet, measured defiance. Her jaw clenched, her knuckles white against the manila folder in her lap, but her face remained unreadable. Years of courtrooms, depositions, hostile hearings, and closed-door negotiations had trained her to wear masks better than most. She knew if she so much as flinched, she'd give him power. So she stayed still, unmoving, unbothered. A flame disguised as stone. Judge Kemp didn't stop there. "I said, has this woman been screened?" he repeated louder now, eyes locked on the bailiff. "People like her have a tendency to disrupt proceedings." And just like that, the insult turned into something more insidious. He wasn't just questioning her presence. He was labeling her dangerous, painting her as a disruption, a problem, a warning sign. Not because of anything she'd said, not because of anything she'd done, but simply because she was there. Black, female, alone, and unbending. The air around Jasmine had gone dense, like a storm was pressing in on the courthouse walls, but only she could feel it. She stood her ground, steady, professional, her breathing controlled down to the second. Every instinct she had screamed to fire back, to strip this man's arrogance to the bone, but she held it in. Now is not the time. Instead, she calmly extended the folder in her hands toward the filing clerk, her voice even, unwavering. I'm here to submit a civil complaint under Title 42, Section 1983, violation of civil rights. Everything is in order. All I need is a timestamp and processing confirmation. Her words were textbook precise, delivered without a hint of emotion, but in her chest, her heart was a sledgehammer against her ribs. She had spent her life becoming a fortress against this very moment, trained, seasoned, untouchable. But still, she felt it, the weight of a room waiting for her to break. That's when Judge Henry Kemp did something no one in the building expected, or ever should have seen. He stepped down from the bench, literally. The room seemed to hold its breath as his black, judicial robe shifted and flared, with each measured step down the narrow aisle of polished wood. The click of his shoes echoed too sharply, like the sound was trying to punch through the silence. Judges didn't walk into the crowd, not unless there was a disturbance, not unless there was danger, and in that moment, he was making it very clear. She was the disturbance. She was the danger. He stopped less than 2 feet from her, close enough for the fluorescent lights to cast shadows under his eyes, making his face look more skeletal than stern. His hands were clasped behind his back in a mock display of civility, but his eyes, those cold, pale eyes, dripped with something else entirely. Not curiosity, not confusion, contempt. This courtroom doesn't waste time with people who think the law is the reason their lives are in ruins, he said, his voice like rust scraping across iron. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, calculated, the kind of tone a man uses when he's been allowed to speak without consequence for too long. Jasmine didn't flinch, but her jaw clenched slightly just once. He noticed. Of course he did. He took a step closer, violating not just personal space, but professional boundaries with it, and hissed the next line through a twisted half-smile. People like you walk in here thinking you're owed something. Justice, sympathy, what? A redo of all your mistakes? You don't get to rewrite the past just because you filed some fancy paperwork. Around them, the entire courthouse had frozen. A few phones were raised slightly, half-hearted attempts to record without being obvious. A clerk behind the desk pretended to organize files, but her hands were trembling slightly. No one interrupted. No one objected. And that, Jasmine knew, was part of the poison, the silence that makes injustice possible. We don't accept self-made victims here, Kemp said, lowering his voice again, as if it were just between them. Take your accusations and your attitude and walk out that door. Go back to whatever mess you came from. And then came the final blow. He raised one hand, not to strike, but to gesture toward the exit, dismissively, like brushing away an insect. This place isn't meant for people like you. Never was. The words were surgical. They didn't scream. They sliced. They weren't meant to enrage her. They were meant to diminish her, to shrink her into the stereotype he already believed she was. That's how power works when it's unchecked. It whispers with a smirk and waits for you to fall apart in front of witnesses. But Jasmine didn't move, didn't lower her gaze. She stood perfectly still, her fingers still gripping the folder. Not tightly now, not in fear, but with intention. She wasn't going to shout. She wasn't going to defend her worth to a man who had already decided she had none. And yet, even in the stillness that followed, the danger hadn't passed. It was evolving. Because men like Judge Henry Kemp don't retreat when they feel challenged. They escalate. The fact that Jasmine hadn't yelled, hadn't backed down, hadn't shrunk, that she had met his gaze without blinking. wasn't something he could let slide. It was a wound to his ego, a bruise to the authority he wore like a second skin. Jasmine didn't say anything flashy. She didn't need to. Her words were exact, measured, and cut with calm. I have the right to file a civil claim, just like any other citizen in this room. She didn't even raise her voice. But the way she said it, like it was fact and not permission she needed, was enough to make the walls of power around him tremble. Kemp's reaction was instant and volcanic. His face contorted in a way that felt almost primitive, nostrils flaring, jaw twitching, pupils narrowing like a man who'd just been challenged to a duel and didn't know how to win it with dignity. Then his voice exploded. "You dare talk back to a judge?" The words weren't a question. They were an accusation, laced with disbelief and fury that someone like her would dare to speak in full sentences, let alone claim legal standing. The force of his shout shocked the air out of the room. A file slipped from a clerk's hands. A court officer stiffened by the door. The mood, already tense, went brittle. You could almost hear the oxygen drain from the room. He stepped forward again, no longer restrained by any pretense of professionalism. His black robe billowed slightly with each stomp, making him look more like a predator than a public servant. People watched, frozen, eyes darting between Jasmine and Kemp like spectators at a car crash they couldn't stop. His hand twitched, as if tempted to grab the folder from her, rip it apart, tear through the paper, tear down her. But instead, he did something far worse. He paused. Then he looked her dead in the eye and spit. It wasn't a reflex. It wasn't a slip. It was a choice. Cruel, clear, and calculated. The thick splatter hit the center of her folder, sharp and wet. The sound alone, a slap of contempt, made people flinch. It stained the court's emblem printed on the front page. A trail of spit crawled down the side of the folder, leaking into the corners, soaking the typed ink of official documents now disrespected in the most visceral way. It was an act of defilement, not just of paperwork, but of dignity. It was symbolic, brutal, and utterly intentional. Gas tore through the room, audible, raw, unfiltered. A woman near the exit dropped her purse and didn't move to pick it up. A man in a sheriff's jacket muttered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. Even those who had laughed earlier, who had nodded along as Kemp mocked her, now stood still, their faces caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. Because what they had just seen, there was no covering it up, no way to soften it. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a temper flare. It was hatred in action. Public, director, cold-blooded. And what did Kemp do next? He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look embarrassed. He simply squared his shoulders, tugged his robe back into place with a jerk of his arms, turned his back on her, and walked away. His heels clacked against the tile floor like gavel strikes, fading down the hallway with each confident step, leaving behind silence, disgust, and a woman who refused to be broken. Because Jasmine didn't move. She didn't wipe the spit away. She didn't cry. She didn't even look down. Her fingers remained curled around the edges of the folder, soaked and desecrated, but still whole. She stood tall, not out of pride, not out of spite, but out of principle. Her eyes scanned the room once, slowly, not accusing, not pleading, just present, unshaken, bearing witness. And in that courtroom, filled with bystanders, silence, and the fading footsteps of a man who thought he'd won, she became the one thing he never expected. Undeniable. Roughly an hour later, the courthouse intercom crackled to life, its usual monotone announcement carrying an edge of something unfamiliar. Urgency. All court staff, judges, clerks, and legal personnel are required to report to Courtroom 1 immediately for a closed administrative session. Attendance is mandatory. The voice cut off without explanation, leaving behind a hum of confusion. Doors creaked open. Chairs scraped. The hallways buzzed with murmurs and sideways glances. A few staff members traded nervous whispers. "Do you think it's about what happened this morning?" Others pretended not to care, but their hurried footsteps betrayed them. The word federal passed from mouth to mouth like static electricity, hot, sudden, dangerous. By the time the staff filed into the room, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Kemp had returned to the bench earlier like nothing had happened, his face stone still, his robe immaculate, his ego untouched, or so he wanted it to seem. Now he stood behind a long table at the front of the room, flanked by senior clerks and a visibly uncomfortable district coordinator. The lights overhead were too bright, the AC too cold. It didn't feel like a routine meeting. It felt like a reckoning waiting to land. The bailiffs stood straighter. Junior staff fidgeted with pens, folders, anything to keep their hands from shaking. Kemp scanned the room with the hollow calm of a man who had convinced himself the storm would pass over him untouched. But everyone knew. This wasn't ordinary. This was inspection. And inspections from the federal level didn't come announced like this. Not without a reason. Not unless someone very high up had decided it was time to shine a light on the rot beneath the marble. Still, no one knew who was coming. No one expected what came next. The door opened quietly, but the silence it commanded was thunderous. No one stood. No one spoke. Every head turned. Every eye locked on the woman stepping through the side entrance, like a calm storm about to level the building. She walked slowly, without rush, without the need to assert herself, because real power never begs to be noticed. It just is. Jasmine Crockett had returned, but not as they remembered her. Gone was the denim, the civilian posture, the carefully silenced presence. In its place stood a woman forged in steel and strategy. Her tailored suit, dark slate, pressed sharp, caught the courtroom lights with each step, not flashy, but exact. At her chest hung a polished federal badge clipped to a black lanyard with a seal no one could miss. Executive Office of the President of the United States. Beneath it, in crisp white letters, Jasmine Crockett, Senior Legal Advisor. A single line of text had turned the courtroom into a pressure chamber. People leaned back in their seats. A junior clerk gasped and caught it in her throat. The bailiff who had smirked hours earlier now stood still, face pale. Even Judge Kemp, though stone-faced, betrayed a brief flicker in his eyes. A single frame of recognition that screamed louder than any outburst. The room was caught between disbelief and dread, everyone processing what this meant, what it said about them. Jasmine didn't rush. Her heels clicked against the polished floor in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. She climbed the stairs to the front like she'd stood on hundreds of podiums before, and she had. With calm precision, she placed her folder on the lectern, adjusted the mic once, and scanned the room. Her expression wasn't angry, it wasn't proud, it was anchored, the kind of look only someone who had learned not to flinch under fire could wear. Her voice, when it came, was clear, low, and powerful, not through volume, but through focus. It cut through the heavy air like a blade. Good morning. My name is Jasmine Crockett, Senior Legal Advisor to the White House. The silence cracked, just slightly. Someone shifted. A cough was stifled, but she didn't stop. For the last several weeks, I've been overseeing unannounced evaluations of district courts as part of a federal judicial accountability and reform initiative. Today, that includes this courthouse. Her gaze never wavered. She didn't blink. She didn't soften her words. She wasn't here to soothe egos or offer comfort. She was here to say what no one else had dared. This morning, I entered this building as a private citizen, to observe firsthand how this institution treats those without influence, without status. What I experienced, she let the pause hang, just long enough for every guilty heart in the room to start pounding. It was not justice. That sentence landed like a hammer. Heads dropped, faces flushed. Every eye in the room that had once looked at her with condescension now avoided her completely. People shifted in their seats, some unconsciously pulling their hands into their laps, as if trying to make themselves smaller. Kemp stood rigid, frozen behind his desk, trying to keep the robe from slipping off his illusion of control. But Jasmine wasn't done. She would take her time, because every second she stood there wasn't just a reveal, it was a reckoning. Kemp moved like someone waking from a nightmare, stiff and disoriented, but trying to pretend everything was normal. He adjusted the front of his robe with shaky hands, then rose slowly from his seat. His face twitched into a smile, though it wasn't convincing. It looked more like muscle memory than anything genuine, a reflex born from years of pretending authority equals virtue. His voice cracked before the first word even came out. "Ms. Crockett," he began, forcing a cough into his fist. I want to apologize if there's been some sort of misunderstanding." His words were thin, brittle, the voice of a man trying to put out a fire with denial. "I wasn't made aware of who you were. But that was all he managed to get out, because Jasmine didn't give him the courtesy of finishing. She stepped forward, not rushed, not aggressive, but deliberate. Every inch she closed was a warning, and when she looked at him, it was not in anger. It was in clarity, the kind that makes a man shrink without a single insult hurled. Her voice cut through the air like a blade gliding through silk. "You didn't know who I was," she repeated, not as a question, but as an indictment. Then she tilted her head ever so slightly, her tone dipping just enough to turn sharp. "Or did you just never care who anyone was, as long as they didn't look like you?" The sentence landed like a slap that echoed in every corner of the room. Kemp blinked, hard. His throat bobbed. Sweat, now forming visibly along his temples, ran down the side of his face unchecked. His mouth opened slightly as if to respond, but no words came. He scanned the room in desperation, eyes flitting from face to face, looking for someone, anyone, who might meet his gaze. But the room had turned on him completely. No one was laughing now. No one nodded. A court officer who had once stood beside him now studied the floor. A clerk stared into her lap, face flushed, eyes filled with something between guilt and disbelief. Even the stenographer had paused her typing. Kemp was utterly alone, and Jasmine knew it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move closer, but her next words hit with the weight of a verdict. "Judge Kemp," she said, "when you spat on me this morning, you didn't just disgrace yourself. You disgraced the bench. You disgraced this institution. You spit on every single person who ever came into this building, believing that justice still meant something." She turned slightly, addressing not just him now, but the entire room. "You didn't attack me because of what I said. You attacked me because you saw someone you assumed had no power, no name, no worth." Kemp swayed slightly on his feet, as if the room had tilted. His hands gripped the edge of the table behind him, not for support, but as though bracing for the moment the truth finished pulling the ground out from under him. His lips parted, searching for something, anything that could reverse what had just happened. But there was nothing left. No court order, no robe, no booming voice. He had used all of it, wasted it, and now stood in its ashes. Jasmine's gaze stayed locked on his. Her voice, though soft, was unrelenting. "Your mistake wasn't not knowing who I was. Your mistake was thinking it didn't matter." He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The courtroom, still frozen, had become something else entirely now. It was no longer a place of routine authority. It was a witness stand, and every person present had just seen the truth testified without needing to be sworn in. One judge, one woman, and a system laid bare between them. And in that brutal, breathtaking silence, it was clearer than ever. Power doesn't make a person untouchable, but integrity, that's what makes someone unforgettable. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to fake. So Kemp sat, slowly, heavily, quietly. His knees seemed to fold under a weight greater than gravity, the weight of exposure, of public disgrace, of being stripped down in the very space he once ruled without question. The courtroom chair creaked beneath him, but he didn't seem to notice. His arms hung loosely by his sides, like they no longer belonged to him. His spine slouched without the posture of power to hold it up. He blinked once, then again. His gaze didn't move from the wall ahead, but it wasn't looking at the wall. It was looking through it, staring into the wreckage of what came next. Into the silence that follows when you realize you've crossed a line so far behind you that it's not even visible anymore. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came. Nothing clever, nothing legal, nothing rehearsed. Just breathe. Just silence. He was no longer the voice that commanded the room. He was the warning that silence leaves behind. And Jasmine, she didn't watch him fall. She had already turned, not to gloat, not to bask in victory, but because her work wasn't him. Her work was this room, this system, everyone who had watched it happen and said nothing. She pivoted cleanly toward the officials seated along the front row, men and women in suits and badges, many of whom had known Kemp for years, shared lunches, shared cases, shared jokes that pushed boundaries, but never drew blood. Until now. Her steps were steady, composed. Her presence had changed. She was no longer the woman they'd laughed at in the hallway that morning, no longer the nobody holding a folder. She was now the reckoning wearing a name tag. She paused at the center of the room, where the air felt like glass, fragile and ready to shatter at any second. Then she spoke. As of this moment, the Glenridge District Courthouse is officially placed under federal oversight, she announced. Her tone wasn't loud, but it cut through the space like a blade through paper. No one moved. This decision has been authorized under Section 241 of the Civil Rights Act. A formal investigation is underway, effective immediately. The words landed like thunder. No one interrupted. No one even breathed. Jasmine continued, measured, exact, relentless. All case files processed under Judge Kemp's supervision will be reviewed. Cases flagged for irregularities, delays, dismissals under questionable circumstances, they will be re-examined by an independent team. She paused briefly, not for dramatic effect, but to let it sink in. Personnel connected to these cases, whether directly or by inaction, will be questioned under oath. Every decision, every signature, every silence will be accounted for. Now heads began to drop, quietly, carefully. The same officials who once looked at her with smug confidence now avoided her eyes entirely. One clerk visibly winced. Another reached for a water bottle but didn't drink. The room that once held pride now held nothing but guilt. But Jasmine's voice didn't waver. This review is not about revenge, she said. It's about restoration. This courtroom is supposed to be a sanctuary for the vulnerable, not a weapon for the powerful. Somewhere along the way, that truth was forgotten. And beginning today, it will be remembered. She took a single breath, controlled, focused, steady. You may not have spoken when injustice stood next to you, but now you will be required to answer for it. Still, no one looked up. Even Kemp, hunched in his seat, now had one hand raised, not to object, not to fight, but to shield part of his face, as if hiding from the light that had finally come in. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just reclaim her dignity, she reclaimed the courtroom. But Jasmine knew words alone wouldn't be enough. Not here, not now. Power hides behind records, so she brought receipts. With a calm flick of her hand, she pulled out a slim wireless remote and pressed a single button. The courtroom lights dimmed ever so slightly, and a large screen on the wall behind her hummed to life. No introduction, no commentary, just data. The first slide appeared, a clean, color-coded bar graph titled Civil Case Dismissal Rates by Race. Glenridge District Court, 2018 to 2023. The numbers weren't subtle, they screamed. One bar, representing white plaintiffs, stood high in green. The other, black plaintiffs, was thin, short, and bleeding red. Side by side, the disparity was undeniable. Anegihes egi retoskodesi arani. Gasps didn't erupt. They leaked. Quiet, restrained disbelief. A court clerk in the third row blinked hard. A junior paralegal scribbled something, then stopped halfway, pen shaking. Jasmine spoke, not dramatically, not emotionally, but with that precise tone prosecutors use when they already know the verdict. Black citizens filing civil complaints in this courthouse over the last 5 years were 4 times more likely to have their cases dismissed, regardless of merit, evidence, or urgency. She let that hang, then clicked to the next slide. Case samples, dozens. Each one listed with filing dates, plaintiff demographics, summary of allegations, and judge presiding. In nearly every instance, the outcome was the same. Dismissed. In the margin of each, a note. Judge of record, H. Kemp. Jasmine didn't stop. These aren't just numbers. These are stories that never got told, injuries that never got acknowledged, children whose school rights were ignored, families evicted without due process. These were not bad cases. They were ignored cases, silenced cases. And the silence wasn't accidental. It was administrative. The room had stopped blinking. She clicked again. This time, the screen displayed a list. 12 complaint case numbers, each one followed by a label in bold. Filed against Judge Henry Kemp. The dates spanned nearly a decade. The allegations ranged from racial profiling to verbal abuse to procedural tampering. Every case followed by the same note. Resolved internally, no further action. She turned away from the screen. Now it was just her, the silence, and the weight of what could no longer be denied. 12 official complaints, not anonymous letters, not rumors, formal, written accusations, filed through proper legal channels with documentation, and every one of them, every single one, was closed without action. No hearings, no investigations, no consequences. Then with the gravity of a final gavel strike, you know what you call that? Not coincidence, not backlog, not clerical error. You call that complicity. Several officials shifted uncomfortably. One man seated near the back in a gray suit ran his hand over his mouth and avoided her eyes entirely. A woman in a navy blazer lowered her head, suddenly very interested in her own lap. No one spoke, not even Kemp. His hands remained limp at his sides. His breathing was shallow, almost rhythmic, like he was trying to disappear without moving. But Jasmine was still standing, still speaking, still making sure no one looked away this time. This court has not only failed to serve the people of this community, it has systematically betrayed them, covered for itself, and punished those who dared ask why. She looked directly at the officials seated in the front row, those with titles, salaries, and years of silence behind them. Starting today, that betrayal ends, because this building will no longer be a shield for cowards. It will become what it was supposed to be, a place of truth, and that begins with accountability. And with those words, the silence didn't return. It fractured. But exposure doesn't guarantee transformation, only resistance. And now the whispers began. They didn't confront her directly. Cowards rarely do. But in the hours that followed her announcement, as staff filed out in small fractured groups, the muttering started, low and venomous, just beneath the surface. Behind closed office doors and clustered break rooms, voices sharpened into criticism. "She's making a spectacle," one senior court administrator murmured to a colleague, glancing down the hallway to make sure no one was listening. "Dragging us through the mud for political points," said another, a middle-aged attorney whose desk was lined with framed certificates but no record of ever speaking up. Others were more subtle, half jokes, sighs too loud to be innocent, or polite conversations that stopped abruptly whenever Jasmine passed by. In their minds, she hadn't pulled back the curtain on injustice. She had pulled down the whole theater, and that terrified them. They framed her actions not as bravery, but betrayal. "She's attacking the judiciary," one clerk whispered, her tone clipped. "Undermining public trust, making it look like we're all corrupt." A prosecutor leaned against a file cabinet, arms crossed, voice low but sharp. "She didn't come here for reform. She came here for headlines." The irony was suffocating. The very people who had turned away in silence while injustice festered now found their voices to defend the institution, not from abuse, but from accountability. Jasmine became the problem, not the data, not the 4-1 dismissals, not the 12 buried complaints. Her truth was too loud for their comfort, so they tried to muffle it with cowardice, dressed as professionalism. But Jasmine heard them. She always did. Because when you stand for something real, they don't stab you in the chest. They try to silence you with smiles. And in Glenridge, the backlash wasn't fire. It was frost. But the courtroom wasn't the only battlefield. Outside its walls, the narrative was already unraveling across headlines and hashtags. Within 24 hours, Glenridge was no longer just a sleepy courthouse. It was national news. Local media outlets scrambled to cover the fallout, but their tones split like fault lines. One conservative-leaning station aired footage of Jasmine's speech, heavily cropped, of course, and titled the segment "Federal Overreach or Political Theater." D.C. lawyer disrupts small-town court. The anchor, with a carefully neutral voice, asked if her actions were grandstanding for attention and damaging public confidence in the judiciary. Online, a columnist wrote that Jasmine had humiliated a respected judge and called her an outsider with an agenda. The comment section roared with vitriol. She came to destroy, not fix. Typical race baiting from a D.C. lawyer. This is what happens when activists dress like professionals. But not every outlet followed that script. One independent news blog ran a front-page headline in bold, "She said it. She proved it. She shook the system." Another featured interviews with plaintiffs whose cases had been dismissed under Kemp's court. People who, for the first time, were being asked what happened to them instead of why they lost. A young reporter, live outside the courthouse, said flatly into the mic, "It's not every day someone walks into a building full of secrets and turns the lights on. Jasmine Crockett just did that." Social media lit up in parallel universes. In one, she was a fraud. In the other, a fighter. Some called for her resignation. Others wanted her to run for office. The truth didn't matter to everyone, but it mattered enough. Jasmine didn't flinch, because she knew that real change doesn't come with applause. It comes with fire, and you walk through it or you don't walk at all. And as the public's attention deepened, so did the desperation from those exposed. Kemp wasn't done, not yet. 3 days after the courtroom confrontation, a press conference was called outside his private law office, away from the courthouse, flanked by a hastily printed banner and 2 stone-faced attorneys. Cameras clicked. Reporters murmured. Then Kemp stepped up to the podium, looking thinner, paler, but still armed with the arrogance of a man who had never been held accountable. His voice cracked slightly at the beginning, but grew louder as he spoke, not with confidence, but with practiced outrage. "What happened in that courtroom was not justice," he began, eyes sweeping over the cameras like a man auditioning for sympathy. "It was entrapment, a stunt, a setup." He tightened his grip on the podium, leaning forward like a cornered animal, pretending to roar. "I did not know who Ms. Crockett was when she entered that building. She presented herself deceptively. She baited me." The words hit the air like gasoline, waiting for a spark. Some reporters blinked in disbelief. Others took notes, dead-eyed, already sensing the spin. Kemp went on, voice rising. "This wasn't about truth. It was political theater. I've served this community for over 30 years. I have given my life to this court, and now because I refuse to entertain a baseless claim filed by someone hiding their identity, my reputation is being destroyed in the media." He paused, trying to breathe, but the sweat on his brow betrayed him. This is not accountability. It's assassination. Professional, personal, and public. But what Kemp didn't realize, what he still couldn't grasp, was that the cameras weren't protecting him anymore. They were documenting him. His words didn't sway the truth. They magnified the denial. They exposed the entitlement. And as clips of his statement circulated online, side by side with Jasmine's speech and DOJ statistics, the contrast became unbearable to ignore. He hadn't cleared his name. He'd carved it into the wall of everything Jasmine had come to tear down. Kemp's denial echoed through headlines for 2 days. But the Department of Justice didn't waste time debating narrative. It moved on evidence. At 6:07 a.m. on a Monday morning, long before the courthouse doors opened, the DOJ's Office of Civil Rights released a formal statement to every major outlet in the region. It was cold, unapologetic. A scalpel, not a speech. The first line alone stopped readers mid-sentence. "As of this morning, Judge Henry Kemp is placed under immediate suspension, pending investigation into allegations of judicial misconduct, procedural violations, and civil rights infractions." No qualifiers, no softened language, just cause and consequence. The announcement confirmed that 6 civil cases previously closed under Kemp's authority were being reopened for full federal review. These weren't vague claims. They were attached to specific docket numbers, plaintiff names, and documented irregularities. By noon, reporters were camped outside the courthouse steps. DOJ officials in Navy suits and worn briefcases entered through the side entrance. Inside, marshals discreetly escorted court staff to closed-door interviews. Kemp's nameplate was removed from his office door. Not shattered, not dramatic, but methodically unscrewed and boxed away, as if it had never belonged there. The air in the building had changed. It was heavier now, quieter. Secretaries typed slower. Phones were answered with tighter voices. Even those who had once mocked Jasmine in hushed conversations avoided the break room entirely. The building felt like it had been caught breathing in and didn't dare exhale. And those 6 cases, they weren't just numbers in a report anymore. They had faces, stories. One plaintiff, a middle-aged black mother whose housing discrimination suit had been thrown out without hearing, told a local journalist, "When they tossed my case, it felt like I was being erased. Now it feels like someone finally saw me." Another, a factory worker who'd sued for wrongful termination after blowing the whistle on racial slurs at work, simply said, "I never thought I'd get another shot. I thought justice had moved on without me." Jasmine watched all of it unfold, not from a podium, not from a spotlight, but from the back of the courtroom, seated quietly with a notepad in her lap. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to witness the consequence of truth. Every officer she passed now greeted her with a nod, not out of fear, but recognition, because the system had cracked, and she had been the wedge. But she didn't smile. Not yet, because a suspension wasn't justice. A reopened case wasn't a conviction. It was just the first inch forward in a marathon of repair. And in that moment, as investigators moved through the hallways with clipboards and sealed folders, Jasmine understood something deeper than headlines or praise. Real justice doesn't happen when the cameras are rolling. It happens when systems are finally forced to turn around and look at themselves. But justice doesn't end with exposure. It begins again with responsibility. Jasmine understood that. She knew the headlines would fade, the cameras would eventually leave. But the harm done inside those courtrooms, the lives derailed, the voices silenced, the dignity crushed under routine indifference, that would linger unless something real replaced the rot. So on a gray Tuesday morning, under the glass dome of the Glenridge Courthouse, Jasmine called a press conference, not to speak of what had been broken, but to announce what would be built in its place. The rotunda was packed. Reporters lined the back wall. Community leaders, court staff, even a few plaintiffs from the reopened cases stood along the marble pillars. The tension was thick, but there was something else underneath it now. Something new. Anticipation. Jasmine stepped up to the podium, a thin stack of papers in one hand, a steel resolve in the other. She wore no smile, no makeup for the cameras, just a charcoal gray suit and the badge of the Office of the White House Counsel pinned firmly over her heart. Her voice, when it came, was steady, but carried the weight of every name, every file, every unheard plea. What happened in this courthouse wasn't just misconduct. It was cultural, systemic, baked into daily routines and protected by silence. That silence ends today. She paused, just long enough for everyone to sit up straighter. Effective immediately, we are establishing the Glenridge Independent Oversight Commission. She let the words ring, then broke them down. This panel will be made up of veteran civil rights attorneys, retired judges with no ties to this circuit, and community representatives selected by public nomination. Their job will not be ceremonial, it will be surgical. She clicked a remote. Behind her, a screen lit up with the structure of the commission. Names, roles, responsibilities, deadlines. The room murmured. The weight of what she was building began to register. This body will have access to every courtroom proceeding, every dismissal, every sentence. They will track patterns of bias, document disparities, and issue quarterly reports directly to the Department of Justice, not the clerk's office, not a back room, public, transparent, permanent. She didn't blink. She didn't soften her voice. She wasn't asking for support. She was issuing a directive. This courthouse will no longer be governed by reputation. It will be governed by results, and results will be measured by fairness, not fear. A pause, then she took one small step closer to the mic and delivered the line that would be quoted for weeks. A courtroom is not a stage for power. It is a sanctuary for trust. It didn't need applause. It landed like a gavel. In the silence that followed, you could feel the shift. Not celebration, accountability finally taking root. Journalists scribbled notes faster. A community organizer in the back wiped her eyes. A former court translator stood still with his arms folded, nodding just once. Jasmine stepped back, lowered her folder, and didn't speak again. Because the most powerful part had already been said. 6 months had passed since the Glenridge courthouse underwent its seismic transformation, and every echo of the old system seemed more distant each day. The marble floors, once a cold reminder of bureaucratic indifference, now gleamed with renewed purpose as staff hurried between offices, carrying folders they actually meant to read. Posters on the walls invited citizens to attend community feedback sessions, promising that any voice raised in good faith would be heard. Where tension and frustration once lingered, a cautious sense of optimism took root, like grass sprouting through cracked pavement. New interns, bright-eyed and restless, shadowed seasoned legal aides who refused to let important cases slip away under piles of paperwork. The hush that used to blanket the corridors had been replaced by the low, energetic hum of people actually collaborating, exchanging ideas about fairer practices and streamlined processes. At times, it felt like witnessing the birth of a new institution, one determined to succeed where its predecessor had failed. Of course, a system steeped in decades of bias could not reinvent itself overnight, but these early months suggested that genuine progress, however fragile, had begun. And at the heart of it all remained the steadfast presence of Jasmine Crockett, whose quiet vigilance kept the momentum alive. From the outside, the courthouse looked much the same. An austere, neoclassical facade framed by towering columns, drab walls rising toward a sky that shifted from stormy gray to pale blue on any given day. But inside, the changes were impossible to miss, especially for those who had known the building's old ways. For one thing, visitors were no longer stopped by bored receptionists with icy stares. They were greeted by a newly appointed welcome coordinator, a calm, middle-aged woman who took pride in handing out pamphlets on available legal services. If a tenant was on the verge of eviction, she would direct them to the free legal aid clinic. If someone needed to file a civil rights complaint, she would offer guidance rather than suspicious glances. The shift from obstruction to assistance felt almost surreal, as if some invisible hand had flipped the moral compass of the entire building. Observers noticed that the walls had been repainted in lighter tones, subtle but noticeable, and the harsh fluorescent lights had been replaced with softer LEDs that gave the corridors a warmer glow. No one claimed these superficial adjustments solved the deeper problems, but they hinted at a willingness to move away from the cold austerity of the past. At every turn, you could sense an institutional hunger for redemption, even if some remnants of the old guard still grumbled behind closed doors. Among the most visible innovations was the expanded roster of pro bono legal specialists, young attorneys eager to prove themselves, and seasoned lawyers who had grown tired of private practice and wanted to serve a greater cause. They worked hand in hand with social workers and community advocates, forming rapid response teams for urgent cases like unlawful evictions, workplace discrimination, or even simple disputes that could be mediated before spiraling into costly trials. Their offices were located right off the main lobby in a space once used for overflow storage. Now it was bustling with the chatter of dedicated professionals drafting affidavits, scheduling hearings, and making phone calls to neglected claimants who had once been dismissed as nuisances. Each day, they posted the number of citizens they helped on a whiteboard, an act of transparency that sparked optimism among passers-by. Clerks who had long been jaded found themselves re-energized by this new atmosphere of genuine engagement. It became standard practice for attorneys to step outside their offices to greet clients personally, guiding them through the labyrinth of legal procedure that once felt like a cruel puzzle. Even skeptics couldn't deny the tangible results. Fewer cases were being tossed out on technicalities, and more disputes were resolved with fair settlements before reaching trial. As word spread throughout the community, foot traffic at the courthouse soared, not because people suddenly loved filing legal forms, but because they believed the system might actually work in their favor now. Such hope had been a rare commodity just half a year ago. Meanwhile, the mandatory ethics and bias training sessions had become the new battleground for minds still resistant to change. Scheduled once a week in the courthouse's largest conference room, these workshops were led by retired judges, civil rights attorneys, and even local activists who had once been branded as agitators. At first, attendance felt forced. Staff slouched in chairs, crossing their arms, rolling their eyes, or muttering about bureaucratic overreach. Yet something shifted after the second or third session, when participants were asked to confront real-life scenarios pulled directly from Glenridge's own records. Cases where a tenant was evicted due to a hidden bias, or a mother's custody plea was ignored because of assumptions about her background. These stories were no longer abstract. They reflected what had happened under the very roof where they now sat. Slowly, arms uncrossed, posture straightened, and some staffers began taking notes with genuine concern rather than passive compliance. A few bold souls even raised their hands to share personal experiences, admitting they'd looked the other way when Kemp pushed through questionable rulings. It wasn't a neat narrative where everyone held hands by the end, but you could see seeds of self-awareness taking root in people who once treated bias as someone else's problem. Beyond training, the courthouse introduced quarterly town hall meetings, a concept that made many of the old guard grimace in disbelief. Civic leaders, activists, and everyday citizens packed the newly repurposed assembly hall, an airy room on the second floor that had previously housed musty file cabinets. At each gathering, a microphone stood at the front, and anyone could step up, voice their concerns, and receive an on-the-spot response from the panel of administrators and attorneys. Some nights, the room erupted with passionate pleas, a father demanding to know why his child's case dragged on for months, a young woman furious her harassment complaint hadn't been taken seriously. Tension crackled in the air, but staff and officials were expected to respond with transparency rather than defensiveness. Over time, these sessions evolved from confrontational spectacles into collaborative discussions. By their fourth meeting, community members began suggesting constructive improvements. A local pastor proposed a mediation hotline, an educator offered to run literacy clinics for pro-SE litigants, and a group of concerned parents volunteered to translate court documents into multiple languages. Suddenly, the courthouse wasn't just a fortress of verdicts. It became a breeding ground for new ideas that might reshape how justice was experienced, rather than merely dispensed. People left those town halls both exhausted and invigorated, carrying a sense that change, while messy, was undeniably happening. As for Jasmine, she stayed busy ensuring that every reform was more than just lip service. Each morning, she arrived before most staff, greeting the new arrivals, some starry-eyed, some uncertain, while scanning the day's docket for any red flags. She'd make unannounced visits to different departments, gently reminding them that accountability did not stop at a press release. Sometimes she watched hearings from the back of the courtroom, quietly observing how judges questioned the parties, how attorneys presented evidence, and how clerks facilitated paperwork. The moment she sensed old habits creeping back, files lost, attorneys ignored, or plaintiffs dismissed with a sneer, she'd jot down notes and request immediate follow-up from her oversight team. Her presence was never loud or intimidating. It was simply constant, like the hum of electricity that keeps the lights on. Despite inevitable pushback, her authority was respected in ways that made it clear she had transcended any label of outsider. The courthouse had, in a strange twist, become her domain, a place where she fought not for power, but for a system that worked for everyone. Even those who secretly resented her influence had to concede the positive changes, if only grudgingly. Still, the path was anything but smooth. Whisper campaigns occasionally flared up, accusations that Jasmine's reforms were too stringent, that they slowed down vital procedures, or bred paranoia about every decision being second-guessed. A few senior judges privately moaned to colleagues that the courthouse felt like a fishbowl, with every ruling monitored by the Oversight Commission. And indeed, the commission, composed of retired judges, civil rights lawyers, and community representatives, was relentless in its scrutiny, demanding case reviews and requesting data on judge performance metrics that no one had bothered to track before. Tensions rose during closed-door sessions where certain staff felt attacked or singled out, leading to heated arguments that spilled into hallways. Yet, ironically, these very disputes served as proof that transparency was working. It forced issues into the open instead of letting them fester in secrecy. Over time, skepticism began to fade. replaced by a begrudging acceptance that perhaps the days of rubber-stamping justice were over. Those who couldn't adapt resigned or retired early, leaving vacancies filled by a new generation of professionals eager to be part of something real, something they could take pride in. The cultural shift, while incomplete, had woven itself into the daily operations, like the slow but unstoppable turning of a tide. By now, 6 months felt both fleeting and monumental, an awkward adolescence in the life of an institution trying to outgrow decades of wrongdoing. The Glenridge courthouse was far from perfect, but each day brought fresh victories. A fair settlement reached swiftly, an immigrant family offered translation services without delay, a survivor of discrimination receiving sincere apologies instead of dismissals. Local newspapers ran a few positive headlines, marveling at the miracle in Glenridge, while radio talk shows debated whether the transformation would hold once the spotlight moved on. Jasmine, for her part, remained steady at the helm, refusing to be swept away by praise or worn down by criticism. Sometimes, after a long day, she'd linger in the main corridor, gazing at the swirl of humanity passing through. The bailiff offering directions with a polite nod, the paralegal loading a cart full of documents to deliver to the free legal clinic, the tearful litigant stepping out of a hearing with genuine relief on her face. Each moment reaffirmed why she'd stepped into this fight, why she'd confronted a judge who spat on her, why she'd risked her own reputation to spark a revolution of simple, tangible decency. Because in every victory, no matter how small, one truth shone through. Justice, when treated with respect, can change the heart of a place and maybe even the soul of its people. And that was enough to keep her pushing forward, fueled by a sense of duty that transcended any temporary headlines or fleeting controversies. And yet, even in the midst of cautious optimism and evolving policies, there remained moments that truly embodied the spirit of a reformed Glenridge courthouse. One such moment arrived when an elderly woman, thin, stooped, her hair caught in a loose bun, walked through the lobby doors, clutching a battered envelope of evidence. She had been turned away 3 separate times in the past, her complaints about predatory housing contracts waved off by dismissive clerks who saw only her frail body, her worn clothes, and her quavering voice. This time, she was greeted by a newly hired intake specialist who did not so much as blink at her age or appearance before directing her to the free legal aid desk. Within minutes, she was seated in a small conference room, detailing the shady tactics of her landlord to an attentive attorney who promised swift action. Overhearing the exchange, 2 paralegals offered to expedite her paperwork, cutting what might once have been a month-long delay down to less than a week. It was not a grand gesture. There were no cameras and no speeches, but for her, it was everything. When she left that room, tears of relief sparkled in her eyes, as if a weight she'd carried alone for years had finally been lifted. Outside, she paused to absorb the change in atmosphere, marveling that the courthouse, once the source of her deepest discouragement, might now hold the key to restoring her dignity. As her case progressed with unprecedented efficiency, word spread through the corridors that the old lady with the envelope had already been assigned a hearing date. News of this transformation filtered in whispers from one clerk to another, fueling conversations about how far the courthouse had come in only half a year. Some of the more senior staff, accustomed to seeing people like her brushed aside, wore astonished expressions as they watched official documents move through the system at record speed. The younger employees simply smiled, proud to witness the fruits of reforms they had been working towards since Jasmine Crockett arrived. It was under that changed dynamic that a small assembly was scheduled in the main lobby, a subdued but symbolic occasion to commemorate the courthouse's newfound direction and to highlight the individuals who had persevered through early skepticism. Ornate chairs were arranged in a semicircle, and a modest podium stood at the center, flanked by tall windows that let in beams of midday sunlight. A sense of guarded celebration filled the air, not triumphant, but hopeful, as though everyone recognized the distance they had yet to travel. Some members of the Oversight Commission chatted quietly, exchanging final notes on upcoming reviews and training sessions. And in the background, as staff mingled and waited for the brief ceremony to begin, the old woman herself quietly sorted her newly printed forms, her face betraying both gratitude and a lingering disbelief that justice might finally work in her favor. The assembly commenced with a few words from the chief clerk, who acknowledged the tremendous effort put forth by both veterans of the courthouse and newcomers seeking to implement more humane policies. But the true highlight arrived when a young attorney took the podium. A woman who couldn't have been more than a few years out of law school, her voice trembling not with fear, but with emotion. She spoke about the intimidation she had once felt stepping into a field dominated by cynicism, where lofty ideals of fairness could be crushed under procedural shortcuts and hushed biases. "I almost quit in my first year," she admitted, gaze flickering across the assembly, lingering on older attorneys who nodded in empathy. Then she singled out Jasmine Crockett, who stood to the side, blending into the small crowd with characteristic understatement. "If it wasn't for you, Ms. Crockett," the young lawyer continued, her words slicing through the gentle hum of the air conditioning, "I'd never have found the courage to keep going." A stunned hush fell over the group, each person aware of the weight behind her confession, the exhaustion, the disillusionment, the near surrender to a system that often devoured idealists. Jasmine, expression earnest, gave a barely perceptible nod as if to say, "I'm simply doing what must be done." Somehow the silence that followed felt fuller than any applause might have, because in that pause, the collective heartbreak of what had been lost met the stubborn hope of what was now possible. Afterward, clusters of staff, attorneys, and citizens mingled in the corridor, discussing everything from upcoming ethics reviews to the old woman's promising legal progress. A paralegal confided that she'd once turned away 3 people in a single day under Judge Kemp's reign, citing insufficient documentation when really she'd just been told to keep the backlog low. Another shared a memory of rushing to finalize dismissals on flimsy grounds because that was how the system operated before transparency took root. Yet now that culture of fear and helplessness had cracked, replaced by an imperfect but sincere determination to do better. As for Jasmine, she listened more than she spoke, gently guiding conversations toward solutions, rather than dwelling on blame. She lingered near the young attorney who'd praised her, exchanging a few hushed words of encouragement, before excusing herself to greet new volunteers from a local law school. In one corner of the hall, the old woman clutched her envelope of documents with a look of fierce pride, determined to see her case through. It was that sight, that quiet resolve in someone who had once been dismissed 3 times, that underscored the true impact of what had transpired in Glenridge. And while the path forward was long and winding, on this day it felt as though, for the first time in years, the courthouse had finally chosen to walk alongside its people rather than stand in their way. When the day's proceedings ended, a hush fell across the lobby, as though every voice had paused for Jasmine's final words. She lifted her gaze, scanning a crowd of clerks, lawyers, and citizens, each face caught between hope and lingering doubt. In a voice free of arrogance, yet demanding to be heard, she gave them the truth they needed. "The law cannot be fair if those who enforce it forget the worth of every human being," she said, eyes unwavering. "And justice does not live in a judge's chair. It resides in the actions of those who dare to speak, who endure scorn to change the system." Her words sliced through the tension like a razor, proving no black robe or lofty title could claim moral high ground while trampling the very people it was meant to protect. She paused, letting the echoes settle along the marble walls, daring everyone to reckon with what they had allowed. Her statement was not a flourish, but a challenge. Stand for what is right or remain complicit in comfortable silence. In that quiet moment, Glenridge felt less like a courthouse and more like a testament to how courage can reshape an entire world. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.